Hello and welcome to the classroom part of the course. Today we're going to be talking about the Constitution and the constitutional framework. And let me just explain a little bit of the organization of this part of the class. Behind me to my right, you have the section or the title of the lecture, which is the constitutional framework. On my left, you have the elements of the objectives of what we're going to talk about. Today we have understand the difference between a nation and state. We also are going to be talking about the elements of the American nation, the elements of the American state, and again, go through the parts of the Constitution. So let's first start with what is a nation and what is a state. And again, please forgive the lack of performance professionalism or the stumbling that may occur sometimes. These are, again, my amateur attempts to try to simulate the classroom environment. It's much more, I would much rather meet in person, but because of the situation we find ourselves in, this I think is the best solution we have. So together we can make this successful, and again, welcome. So let's define a nation. What is a nation? A nation is the elements or characteristics that create the uniqueness of people. Culture, language, race, religion. These are the things that make the characteristics of people unique. So if I go to Greece, the people speak Greek. The people have a shared religion of Greek Orthodoxy. Most of them have the same racial characteristics, and they have traditions and social mores that are very similar. So if I go to China, Iran, or any other country in the world except the United States. And later on, we're going to talk about what are the elements of the American nation. So all of those things that we think about a nation, culture, language, religion, mores, perspective, all of those things are what a nation is. What is a state? A state is a legal definition. A state is a piece of geography where the government has a monopoly of police powers or coercion. The state is a geographic entity or a piece of land in which the government, or whatever you want to call that organization, has a monopoly again, you have to forgive my spelling, a monopoly of coercion. So we can see the difference. So we have Mexico. Mexico is a piece of land. The government doesn't have a monopoly of coercion with the drug cartels and with the other elements that control the police powers of that piece of geography? Yes and no. Same with Pakistan, some areas in Africa, such as Rwanda or the Congo. These different areas, one could question this definition. So what is the criteria that we use? How can we determine what is a state and what is not a state? Well, it is a very subjective criteria, and it's based on other states' recognition. What is the recognition? So, for example, the United States does not recognize the Turkish Republic in Cyprus. The United States for 40, 50 years did not recognize the People's Republic of China. So it is a legalistic idea. It is a legalistic form. So this is, when we talk about the state, we're talking about Geography, a piece of land that is controlled by an entity, usually called a government, and they have a monopoly of coercion or of the police powers. When we talk about a nation, we're talking about the linguistic, the racial, the cultural, the different characteristics that make us all different. So this is a significant difference of thought because they're not interchangeable things. They're not interchangeable concepts. So again, let us think in terms of nation and state and make sure that we have those two definitions clear. So a nation, again, is culture, religion, language, social mores, all of these different things that make a nation special and that give people pride in the nation that they belong to. Now we have conflict when, and I would contend that a lot of the conflict we have in the post-World War II era is that people's nations and their states do not align. When they look at their passport, they do not see the language that they may talk at home. So this is, again, some of the basics of conflict that we see, at least in the international realm. So this is, again, a very, very fundamental but important distinction between nation and state. Traditionally, we have had the nation and the state controlled by either a king or some type of personal rule. And that rule usually, the legitimacy of that rule usually comes in with this idea of God made me king, right? You have the divine right of kings. The divine right of king. If God wanted you to be king, you would be king. God made me king. It's a pretty tough argument, right? If you're Catholic, you understood that when John Paul II, the Pope, was very, very ill, and some of the cardinals would come to him and say, maybe you should retire, maybe you should resign. His argument was, I'll go home when God wants me to go home. It's a pretty tough argument. They argue against God. But during this philosophical period called the Enlightenment, people did. People started to question this idea of the divine right of kings. Why should God put such an immoral person as the ruler? And again, this idea of semi-religious or a person who is a demigod rules us comes from China, Japan, and also other traditions, not just in Western Europe. But the Enlightenment starts talking in terms of, wait a minute, what about the social contract? What about the idea of us determining who is going to rule us? And this is really the foundation of both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. This idea that we have a right to say, we have a right to question the relationship between God and the individual. So the Enlightenment and this idea that we can question the relationship between God and the individual is at the heart of the American Revolution. So when people talk about these documents that we're going to read, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, were divinely inspired. That may be because, as we know, the founding fathers were people of faith. I'm not saying that they weren't people of faith. I'm saying that they were starting to question this all-encompassing idea that a king is a okay system of government. A king is a way to have a system that we can't reform on, we can't change. So again, the Enlightenment and the idea that God, if God is just, God would not have this kind of government. God would not have this kind of system of society. So this is, again, these are the seeds of what we have in the Constitution. So we have the Revolution. We have the Declaration of Independence, a beautiful document that we're not going to go and read fully, but I encourage you to look at it. It talks about basically the Declaration of Independence is a divorce decree, right? It says that the American colonists are no longer sovereign, are no longer politically attached to Britain. That doesn't mean the nation is different, right? It means that the sovereignty, the state, the American colonists are no longer part of the state that we call Great Britain. So we have a war. The war lasts 8 years. It's a terrible war. And we have the emergence of an American colonist and American sovereignty. And the first government we have is the Articles of Confederation. It is a failure. It has an economic failure, and it also is a foreign policy failure. And so we have the Philadelphia Convention, where the founding fathers attempt to reform the Confederation of Articles of Confederation, and they throw it away. They basically start over. And the question is, can we have a sovereign? Can we have a sovereignty that is not a king? And this is, again, this becomes so we're not going to have a king. We are going to instead have some other form of legitimacy. Right? What kind of government are we going to have, and what kind of government are people going to respect? This, again, is a big question. And it is the first time in human history that, at least since ancient times, one could argue that the Greeks and the Romans had republics. But again, let me remind you that the Greeks and Romans had a very different definition of what was Greek and Roman than what we do, of what we consider what is an American. And it was a very, very narrow slice of the population that participated in what they would call democratic or republican forms of government or control. They had no idea. No one had any idea of what type of government we should have. And you had people like Madison and Hamilton and others that sat down, John Adams, sat down and started talking about these politically philosophical ideas of how do you have a just government. So that's where we begin with the Constitution, and let's take a look at what the finished product was. In your textbook on page 8, there is the Constitution of the United States. We're going to go through this Constitution, and we're going to go through it word by word so that you understand what the Constitution is. Again, our 5th objective, you understand the elements of the Constitution, but also because we have, these are the rules of the game. So let's start. Let us begin. On page 9 in your textbook, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. This is the preamble. We're going to go through this because this really is the definition of the American nation. And after I finish this part of the discussion, you're going to see how these elements do define us. And it's maybe different than what you thought. It may be different than what you have grown up and thought of, that these characteristics of what our society is. So let's start with those first 3 words, we the people, right? So we're talking again about legitimacy. And those first 3 words, we the people, what does this mean? What does this mean? Well, again, when we compare this idea of the divine right of kings, where God picks someone, picks a trait, picks the ruler of a state, of a nation. Instead, our founders are saying, no, we can have a say. We can have a say. We know that God wants us to have a say in how we are governed, what they call the social contract. So we the people is an idea that comes from, if you remember this idea of sovereignty, we the people is the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. We as a group, we as a collective, have the right to form a legitimate government. We have the right to deal with this idea of collective agreement and input and participation and all these different things. So the first step in deciding what type of government the United States is going to have is this idea of popular sovereignty, we the people of the United States. Okay, so why? Why would you want, or why do you need a government? In order to form a more perfect union and establish justice. Establish justice. Now, when we think of justice, what do we think of? When we say that's unjust, when we think of justice, what do we think of? You go down in Santa Ana in California and you have a building called the Hall of Justice. What does that mean? Well, it means, normally, it means, right, law. When we think of justice, we think of law, of rules, of the enforcement of laws. And so this is the second element. This is the second element of what makes the American nation. We have popular sovereignty. The second is the rule of law. The rule of law. This is why in our popular culture, this sort of degrading law, degrading the civil code, degrading, well, it's not illegal if you don't get caught, those kind of cultural sayings or slogans can really be corrosive when we're talking about the legitimate form of government, our legitimate form of the Constitution. So in order to form a more perfect union, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, peace, right? Domestic tranquility. How do we get along? To provide for the common defense and promote for the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. So this is not something, the Constitution is not something that's going to be here for 10 years. Other countries have constitutions that expire. Now ours can be amended, but ours does not go out of date. Ours does not expire. And so this idea of liberty, right? Again, when people are talking in terms of liberty, we always say, I have my rights. I have my rights. But liberty, right? When we think about liberty, it is also a two-way street, isn't it? If you have rights and I have rights, then the only way it works is when we recognize each other's freedoms. We recognize each other's differences. And so the third element, the third really important element of the American nation is this idea of tolerance. We may disagree on a lot of different things, But I have to recognize, and you have to recognize, that that disagreement is in the sphere of liberty. And again, in our popular culture, in our popular, the era that we live in today, a lot of people do not talk about tolerance of the other person, even if it's a fundamental disagreement. And that's what politics is about. We have rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations come about, and we are, right, we are engaged as members of our society to obey those rules and regulations or try to change those rules and regulations. But just because I might feel a certain aspect of a certain problem, I might have made up my mind, that doesn't mean that you don't have that freedom to make a different conclusion. So what does this mean? Does this mean I have to accept things that I find immoral? Or does it mean that I have to accept things that I fundamentally disagree with? No, tolerance is not acceptance. Those are two different things. Tolerance is the idea that I disagree with it, but I also understand the fundamental reasons of why you may want to do that. But I can shun, right? The whole idea of, right? I can make a pact with myself that I will not participate with people who are doing a certain practice. I will not give them any of my money or any of my economic power to help them with that practice, or that I can try to do, right, not associate with people that are doing that certain practice. It's very powerful. Now, sometimes those things become, things that may be important to one generation are no longer important to another generation. But again, it's not, you don't have to accept it, but you have to understand that people have the freedom to exercise their own liberty. And the founding fathers were trying to, and again, trying to incorporate this idea of tolerance as a true American element of our society. So again, the preamble is a recipe. The preamble is the organization, is the argument for legitimacy of why we have this government. We start with the Constitution, we start with this preamble because this is our government. This government is something that we are part of. When you hear politicians and you hear other groups say, those guys in Washington, or that government, what they're forgetting is it is ours. It is all of ours. And the preamble gives a recipe. The preamble gives these elements of what makes an American. What doesn't the preamble include? It does not include any cultural aspects. It does not say English is the official language of the United States. It does not say you have to be white and have blue eyes to be an American. It does not say you have to be a Christian. It does not say that you have any type of racial, cultural, social mores that creates the American nation. Again, it's incredible. It's new. And it's one of those things that is truly revolutionary. No other country in the history of mankind has ever said, we are going to form a nation based on these three elements: popular sovereignty, rule of law, and tolerance. No other nation, none. If we go through even the ancients of the Romans and the Greeks, there was a racial, language, other the things that we talked about a nation, there was that type of definition. Not in the United States. Now, some of you may say, well, wait a minute, the founding fathers were slaveholders. True, very true. Or wait a minute, the American Revolution was not a true revolution in the terms of the Marxist terms of revolution, but only a change in the elite of who controlled the North American continent that we call the United States. Maybe. But again, what we have to understand is the Constitution is a living document. and we fought a civil war to end slavery. And just because the social mores or the perspective of the people in 1787 was X doesn't mean that it's still true today. And so what this paragraph is aspirational. But in our society, and what's important to us, is that it also is law. It also is the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, which is different, which is very different than any other time, again, in history. Our Constitution, this Constitution that we've inherited, is unlike other constitutions because most constitutions are political documents, right? If you're interested in history and you look at the old Soviet Constitution, or if you look at some of the things that the People's Republic of China has in their constitution, what are those things? Those are political documents because those countries are ruled by men, right? President Putin on his 23rd year of power, or President Xi eliminated term limits of the chairmanship of the People's Communist Party. Those are countries that are ruled by people, that are ruled by what they say, ruled by men. And I don't mean to be gender specific. Our country is a country that the Constitution has turned into a legal document. Therefore, we are a country of laws. And this country of laws is one of those things that can really ensure that we can strive for justice. So again, popular sovereignty, rule of law, and tolerance is this idea of the preamble. Why put the preamble in there? Why even bother? Because again, the founding fathers wanted to have a situation in which the legitimacy of the country was based not on these traditional elements of power that the countries, except for the United States, have, but they wanted to bring the elements of the Enlightenment. They wanted to bring the elements of the individual, and they wanted to make sure that we could have a society based on popular sovereignty, rule of law, and tolerance. In the next part of the Constitution, we will talk about the actual articles that create the structure of our government. We'll see you soon.